Before we begin this webinar, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to the elders past and present. We would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. My name is Christina Alchamisi and I work as a lawyer at Legal Aid New South Wales as part of the Community Legal Education team. And I'm joined today by Maryam Hamoudi, who also works for Legal Aid New South Wales, and she is a solicitor with the immigration team. Hi, Maryam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Christina. Thank you for having me.
Great. So I just want to let all the attendees know that with this webinar today, we're not providing legal advice, we're providing legal information. If after this webinar you have any questions relating to you or your client's situation, then you can call Law Access New South Wales on 1300 888 529. So let's get started. Maryam, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for attending today's webinar. As Christina said, my name is Maryam Hamoudi, and I work with a team of around 10 other solicitors in the immigration team at Legal Aid New South Wales. We are based in the Central Sydney office, but we do give advice to people all over New South Wales. We give a lot of advice on a variety of immigration issues, all by telephone at the moment because of COVID. And we also represent some people under grants of aid. I've put my email address and phone number on the slide that is showing on the screen right now. And I'm happy for anyone to get in touch with me after today if what you're after isn't covered, or if you'd like to request some CLE on a different topic with our team. And would appreciate any feedback or any requests. All right, so today's webinar will be about bringing or sponsoring family members to come to Australia. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Next slide, thanks, Christina. All right, I'd like to start by going through what I will be talking about in today's session. So today I will be giving an overview of the different pathways to bring family members to Australia. And I will also touch on some of the COVID-19 impacts on immigration law. First, we'll explore what are some of the temporary and permanent pathways to Australia for a family member. Then we'll look at whether visa applications for people offshore, so those who are outside Australia, are being processed during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll also go through what the process is to get exemptions from the travel ban that is currently in place because of COVID. And finally, we'll look at whether there are any financial hardship provisions for hotel quarantine. Now, as I'm going along, if anything isn't clear or you have a question, please submit your questions along the way and I'll be happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. All right, next slide. Thanks, Christina. So what are the temporary and permanent visa pathways to bring family members to Australia? Now, the Australian visa system is made up of many different visa subclasses, all of which are very different and are just made up for a very specific purpose, usually. So very broadly speaking, visas in Australia can be divided into three main categories. The first one is the humanitarian or protection type visas. The second category would be family-sponsored or family stream visas. And finally, student or skilled work or business activity visas. Now, these visas would either be permanent, that allow for an indefinite stay in Australia for the person, or they could be temporary visa that have a set amount of time for the stay in Australia. The Department of Home Affairs website is a useful source of information about these different types of visa options. I've put up on the slide that section of the department's website which lists the different visa options. If you go on the department's website and click on these boxes, like you see on the slide, it leads to or opens up to more information about what sort of visas there are, the current application fees, and current processing or wait times. Here at Legal Aid, we only advise on visitor visas, family stream and humanitarian stream visas. We don't do student visas, work visas, or business activity visas. So if someone needs advice on those visas, they'll need to get advice from a private lawyer or a migration agent. All right, next slide, thanks. Okay, so today I'll go through a brief overview of the visas that we do advise on to bring family members to Australia, and they include, like I said, the visitor visa, humanitarian visas, and the family stream visas. Next, thanks, Christina. All right, so we'll start with the visitor visa. Now, family members can apply to come to Australia for the purpose of a visit on a visitor visa. It is a temporary visa, so the family member can ask to stay for up to 12 months in Australia, but it is up to the Department of Home Affairs for how long they will grant the visa. So we see generally the department grants a visitor visa for 3 months. Now, the current cost for someone outside Australia wanting to apply for a visitor visa is $145. The family member applying for the visitor visa must satisfy the department that they have a genuine intention to visit Australia temporarily, that they have enough money to support themselves during their visit, or they can show that their family member in Australia will be able to and is willing to support them financially during their stay. Thirdly, they must meet the character test, which means they can't have or should not have a criminal record. And finally, they also have to meet health requirements. So showing that they are healthy enough that there is a little risk they will need medical care if they come to Australia. The main reason we see visitor visa applications being refused is that the department are not satisfied that the person is only going to stay in Australia temporarily. They often refuse, we see visitor visa applications from applicants applying from countries from which Australia receives high number of refugee applications. So, for example, someone applying from Syria is not likely to be granted a visitor visa. Also, for example, someone who has an Australian young child and they want to come to Australia to visit them and spend time with them, the department are likely to assume that this person will want to stay here and to live with their child on a permanent basis and don't have a genuine intention of just a temporary visit or stay. So we do advise that to help visitor visa applications to be successful, it's very important to provide the department with information showing that the purpose of coming to Australia is temporary and the person has an established life to return to in their home country. It's also worth mentioning that currently, because of the travel restrictions to Australia, it is very, very important for any person wanting to lodge an application for a visitor visa to come to Australia that they first get legal advice. All right, next slide, Christina, thank you. All right, so moving on to humanitarian visas. As you can see, humanitarian visas are divided up into 3 categories. The first category of people are those who arrive to Australia by boat. Now, these people are only eligible to apply for temporary protection visas in Australia. This is either the Safe Haven Enterprise Visa, is usually known as SHEV. It is a 5-year protection visa, or they can apply for the Temporary Protection Visa, TPV, which is a 3-year visa, 3-year protection visa. Now, the second category of people are those who arrive to Australia by plane on a valid visa, and then they later wish, after arriving to Australia, they later wish to apply for protection if there's been changes in the circumstances back in their home country and they now have fears and they want to apply for protection. These people would be eligible to apply for a permanent protection visa within Australia. Now, the last category relates to the Offshore Resettlement Program, and this is for people who are outside Australia and in need of humanitarian assistance. As you can see on the slide, all the offshore resettlement visa subclasses that are in black are visas that a person cannot apply for directly to the Department of Home Affairs. So people who are granted these visas usually they would have been assessed as refugees and referred to Australia for resettlement by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. Whereas the visa subclasses that are in red, they are the ones that a person can sponsor a family member overseas to come to Australia on. These are the global special humanitarian and the split family cases, which I will talk about today. Next slide, thanks, Christina. So, on a global special humanitarian visa, a person can ask to bring or sponsor their family member to come to Australia, or family members to come to Australia through the Australian government's humanitarian program. Now, to be able to sponsor the family member on this humanitarian visa, the person needs to be either a permanent resident of Australia or an Australian citizen. Now, they don't need to have come to Australia as refugees themselves, and there are no waiting periods from when, let's say, the person comes to Australia, arrives to Australia, until they can apply to sponsor a family member. As long as they are a PR or Australian citizen, they can be a sponsor for family members to come to Australia on the humanitarian visa. Now, as for the family member who's overseas, to be eligible to apply to come to Australia under this humanitarian program, they need to first be outside their home country. Now, there is an exception to this rule if the person is making a split family application, and I will go through shortly the split family application and what that means. The second eligibility requirement is for the family member is they can't have another family, or they can't have another country, where they can live permanently. Also, they need to show or satisfy the department that they are a refugee and in need of protection. Right, next slide, thanks. All right, so I just mentioned that a person needs to be outside their home country before their family member in Australia can sponsor them on a humanitarian visa. Now, there is an exception, as I mentioned, but it only applies to people who meet criteria for a split family application. So let's look at what is a split family application. Well, it's an application where a person can ask to bring their husband, wife, partner, or children. In the case of a child who's under 18, they can ask to bring their parents to come to Australia on a humanitarian visa, even if the family members are still in their home country. Now, for the sponsor to be able to do that, or the sponsor can only do that if they were given or granted a refugee, humanitarian, or permanent protection visa within the last 5 years before they applied to sponsor their family members, and they told the department about their family members before the visa was granted. So they would have needed to list their family members on their visa application, or during any interview with the department, and they needed to have told the department about their family members and their whereabouts and where they were living, and that sort of information. Right, next slide. Thanks, Christina. Now, I have put together some information that I'd like to share about the humanitarian visas. Firstly, while there is no application fee, so it's free to apply, free of charge to apply to sponsor a family member to come on a humanitarian visa. But if the visa is granted, then the sponsor is responsible for paying their family members' plane tickets to travel to Australia. Secondly, it can take a long time to process humanitarian visas. It can take the department anywhere from 12 months to several years to make a decision on the application. And thirdly, there are limited numbers of humanitarian visas granted each year. Now, Legal Aid has received information from the department that for the current financial year, which started on the 1st of July 2020 and will end on the 30th of June this year, 2021, there are 12,000 humanitarian visas allocated to the Offshore Humanitarian Program. And as of December last year, in 2020, there were already 40,000 humanitarian visa applicants applying or have applied. So as you can see, there are far more applicants for humanitarian visas than there are visas available to be granted. So 40,000 applicants with only 12,000 visas available. So not everyone who applies will get a visa. And finally, with the current no entry ban to Australia due to COVID, even if the humanitarian visa has been granted offshore to the person, they still can't travel to or enter Australia on the visa unless an exemption applies, or exemption to enter Australia applies, and has been granted by the department. I'll be going through travel exemptions and how to apply for them later on in this webinar. All right, next slide. Now, moving on to the family stream options to bring family members to Australia. As you can see, I've put on the slide some of the different types or options for family stream visas. There are many different types of family visas that a person can apply for, depending on their family situation and their needs. Some of these options include prospective marriage, partner, visa, child or adoption visas, parents, carer, age-dependent visas, and other types of relative visas, often relative or remaining and remaining relative visas. Unfortunately, we won't have time today to cover these kinds of visa applications in any detail, but as a brief outline, the Pana Visa category, I mean, it's quite evident from its name, is for a person who wants to bring their partner, fiance, husband, or wife to Australia. Same with the child or adoption visa, so if a person wants to bring the child to Australia. Also parent visa, same thing, if a person wants to bring their parents to Australia. Now, as for the carer visa, if the sponsor or a member of their immediate family in Australia, so their partner or children, have a long-term or permanent medical condition, they can apply to sponsor a family member from overseas to come to Australia to care for that person with the medical condition. And finally, with the relative visa option, it is for a person who wants to bring an older relative who is dependent on the sponsor, or wants to bring a relative whose only near relatives or remaining relatives are living in Australia. All right, next slide, thanks. Again, Department of Home Affairs website is a useful source of information if you want more details on a particular type of visa option under the family stream category. As can be seen from the slide, there is lots of information on family stream visa options and availability, and there's a list of all the different types on the website. You can find this information under the section bringing your family or partner here. The website, as you can see, provides more specific information relating to a particular visa subclass. So for example, I put on the slide the information that comes up when you click on a partner visa option, and you can see it provides information about the basic eligibility requirements and the fees, the processing times, and that sort of thing. And the good thing as well, what you can do is you can personalize the page to either applicant or sponsor. As you can see, I've put that there's a little button that you can press and it can change the information available from the perspective of an applicant or from the perspective of a sponsor. And that option will allow you to check the eligibility requirements for the sponsor, for example. And then if you want to change that back to the applicant, the information will be changed to the eligibility requirements for the applicants. All right, next slide. Thanks, Christina. Now, one drawback of family stream applications is that they cost money, and sometimes a lot of money. As a guide of, to how much these applications cost, these visas are set up on screen, the fees of some of the family stream options. If it will take the person too long to save up for the fee, it may be better to lodge a humanitarian visa now rather than wait to save up the money. But is it important to me to stress that this information today is very general, so you should not really rely on it as legal advice. We always recommend that the person talks to a lawyer first about their situation before making any decisions about applying for a particular visa. Next slide, thanks. Okay, now moving on to the next part of the webinar, where we will look at whether visa applications for people offshore are being processed during COVID-19. Next slide, thanks, Christina. Firstly, we'll look at the offshore processing of humanitarian visas. As far as legal aid is aware, since about March 2020, processing of offshore humanitarian visas was deprioritized. However, the department continued to receive and assess applications. Department case managers continued to work on humanitarian applications, visa applications, and we received information from the department that a small number of emergency and urgent cases have been given priority in processing recently. So the processing of offshore humanitarian visas is still continuing and ongoing during COVID. We know that 2,000 offshore humanitarian visas have been granted since the 1st of July 2020 as part of the 2021 humanitarian program. So these 2,000 are from the allocated 12,000 offshore visas that I mentioned earlier for this financial year. Also, the department did say that they still intend to grant a further 10,000 humanitarian visas before the end of this financial year, so before the end of 30th of June 2020. So it does seem like the processing of humanitarian visas will pick up again before the end of this financial year. Now, in relation to the processing of the offshore non-humanitarian visas, for example, the family or temporary visas, we know that these visas are still being processed. We see that their processing is still ongoing, but at a much slower rate than pre-COVID times. Offshore visitor visas are also being processed at this stage. I think we noticed there was a trend at the beginning of the COVID situation. Offshore visitor visas seem to have stopped, but now at this stage, offshore visitor visas are being processed, and overseas posts all now have officers back on duty and are processing paper applications. All right, next slide, thanks, Christina. Now we will look at the process of getting an exemption to enter Australia. Now, currently due to COVID, there are travel restrictions which mean no one can come to Australia unless they are in an exempt category or they have been granted an individual exemption to these travel restrictions. Next slide, thanks. Briefly, let's look at who can enter Australia and on what grounds can a person apply for an exemption to travel to the travel restrictions. A person is automatically exempt from the travel restrictions and can enter Australia without obtaining an individual exemption if they are an Australian citizen or a permanent resident of Australia, or an immediate family member of an Australian citizen or the permanent resident. Now, here immediate family means partner or dependent child, and you can also enter if you are a legal guardian of a child, which basically means if you are the parents of a minor child in Australia. So parents are not included as an immediate family member, and they will need an exemption if they want to come to Australia. Also from the exempt category is a New Zealand citizen who usually is resident in Australia and their immediate family members, usually proof of residency, so driver's license or documents in relation to residency must be presented at check-in. The next type of exempt person would be someone who has been in New Zealand for 14 days or more immediately prior to arrival by air to Australia. Now, as for the grounds to which a person can apply for an exemption, people can apply for an exemption based on compassionate and compelling reasons to travel to Australia. An example of compassionate and compelling reason is, for example, needing to travel due to the death or a critical illness of a close family member. The person will need to have a valid visa. So, for example, for that scenario, the person will need to first apply for a visitor visa. It needs to be granted, and then they need to apply for the travel exemption from the travel restriction and have that granted, and then they can come to Australia once they have both of these steps done. Those who've been granted permanent humanitarian visas offshore, like I mentioned before, and haven't yet entered Australia will still need to apply for an exemption under compelling and compassionate grounds. Initially, it was reported informally that it is extremely hard to get compassionate exemption granted. There were being refused was the word of mouth, including for quite compelling situations. But the statistics now suggest that it's possible. It's worth asking, and if a request for an exemption to travel is refused, a person can try applying again. There is no limit on the number of applications a person can make to request an exemption from the travel restrictions. There are also other individual grounds to apply for the exemption, and they include people invited to Australia by the Commonwealth Government to assist in the COVID-19 response, those who entry would be in the national interest to Australia, and people with critical skills, like for example, medical specialists are also able to apply based on these grounds for an exemption. Next slide, thanks, Christina. Okay, so how does a person apply for the travel exemption? The exemption request needs to be applied for online. The application goes to the Australian Border Force Commissioner, but is made through the Department of Home Affairs website, which I have put up on the screen. Even if the person is an Australian citizen or is a permanent resident and has that automatic exemption, they'll still need to lodge will provide that information about their travel and evidence of their, for example, an immediate family member or Australian citizen or permanent resident. They'll need to provide information confirming that relationship. So they'll be automatically exempted and they will be given exemption, but they still need to submit that request or provide their information, the travel details through that website. Now, the person wanting to lodge a request for an exemption from the travel restriction will need to make an account and lodge the request through that account, and they can check the status of the request through that account. The person must provide information and documents to support their request, so usually a proof of identity, evidence that they hold a valid visa or they have a visa granted, letter from a doctor or hospital indicating, for example, why travel is necessary, or a letter from an employer indicating why travel is necessary. So it just depends on different circumstances and the reasons and what sort of evidence the person will need to support their request. It could also be maybe a stat deck supporting their reasons for travel. The person will need to apply for an exemption at least 2 weeks, but not more than 2 months before the planned travel. And the department says the majority of travel exemption requests to come to Australia are generally finalised within 7 days, but some complex requests may take longer, so it just depends. Usually within 7 days is the general time frame. Next slide. Thanks, Christina. All right, now in this final part of the webinar, we will look at whether there are any financial hardship provisions for hotel quarantine. So unless arriving on a quarantine-free flight from New Zealand, all travellers arriving in Australia, including Australian citizens, must quarantine for 14 days. Also, I think it's worth mentioning from the 22nd January this year, if a person is travelling or transiting through Australia, they must provide evidence of a negative COVID-19 PCR test to their airline, and it needs to have been taken 70 hours or less before their scheduled departure. Okay, next slide, thanks. So what are the fees for hotel quarantine and how can the person pay for them? The way it works is that the New South Wales government will invoice travellers a fixed fee at the end of their stay in the hotel quarantine. The person will not be charged more if they are required to stay in quarantine for longer than 14 days. I've put on a slide that is on the screen now the cost of the quarantine. So as you can see, travellers will be charged $3,000 for one adult, There are additional fees for additional occupants. So for any additional adult, it will cost a further $1,000 each. Children who are under 18 years of age, it will cost $500 each. And for children who are under 3 years of age, there are no additional costs. And all charges are in Australian dollars. After the person checks out, they will get an invoice by email or post within 30 days to pay. If the invoice recipient cannot pay within the due date, within the 30 days, the person may be subject to penalties if they don't pay on time. The invoice will have the due date written on it, so that to know for the person to know when they need to pay, the date that they need to pay by. Next slide. Thanks, Christina. A person can arrange with Revenue New South Wales to get an extension of 14 days to pay the invoice or get a payment plan if they can't pay by the due date. If the payment plan or the extension to pay is still not affordable for the person should contact Revenue New South Wales, who will work with them to determine their capacity to pay the fees. They will be asked questions about their financial and personal circumstances that may be affecting their ability to pay. Usually a 12-month plan is fairly easy to arrange with Revenue New South Wales, but if more time is needed or the person needs longer, for example 12 or 24 months or 2 years, they will need to provide further evidence of financial hardship. In relation to refugee and humanitarian visa holders arriving in New South Wales, recently the New South Wales government have said that they will pay the quarantine costs. Previously, if a person arrived on a humanitarian visa, they were responsible for their own costs of the quarantine. That's no longer the case. The refugee or humanitarian visa holder will still be given the invoice, but they should take it to the Settlement Service International or Red Cross, whoever their humanitarian support program is, and they will send that on to Service New South Wales to pay. Next slide. Thanks, Christina. Okay, so how to refer us a client at Legal Aid. Next slide. So we do telephone advice Monday to Friday. We generally have a limit on how many people we can reasonably speak to in one day. So first come, first serve on our phone number, which is 9219 5790. We also take warm referrals from community workers via our email address. So if you have a client that you would like to refer to our service, that's the email address, immigrationreferrals@legalaid.nsw.gov.au. When you send a referral, we would like to get is the photo page of the client's passport, if it's possible, their inquiry and their situation, if possible, their immigration history. By that, I mean information like when they came to Australia, what visa they came on, what visa they have applied for since, and what happened to those applications. And finally, whether you would like to be kept in the loop about the situation of that particular client. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation on bringing family members to Australia. Did anyone have any questions that they would like to raise?
We've got quite a few questions. Thank you for your presentation, Miriam. So I'm just going to... So we've got a question about whether this webinar will be recorded. So I'll just answer that. Yes, it will be recorded and it will be up on our Legal Aid New South Wales YouTube channel. We've got a question for you here, Miriam. Are maritime arrivals regarded as illegal?
Okay, so maritime arrivals, people arrive by boat. So it's, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to say they're illegal. I mean, they did arrive to Australia without a valid visa, and they can refer to be unlawful in that sense. But for me, I mean, it's legal to seek asylum, whether coming by boat, or they should have the right in that sense. But yeah, so they are considered unlawful, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had a few very case-specific questions, so I've just, I ask you all if you do have any case-specific individual questions that you contact Law Access New South Wales to get some legal advice. We've got a question here. Can I apply for a visitor visa? How can I apply for a visitor visa for my family? So what the process is?
Yeah, I mean, like I put on the slide, it depends. Is the visa is the person outside of Australia? That's a different process. If the person is inside of Australia, it's a different process. I think it's important to speak to us because because of the travel restrictions, it might be difficult. I mean, applying for the visitor visa, you can do that either on an IMI account. You need to create an IMI account and lodge the application that way online. But if the person is not an immediate family member of yours, of an Australian citizen or permanent resident who is in Australia, it might be difficult to have the visitor visa granted. Because it's just there's no point if the person can't enter Australia, they don't have the travel exemption. So it's a case by case. I guess it depends on the particular circumstances of the person. So yeah, I think to get a bit more detailed advice, accurate advice, get in touch with us, have a chat to us, and we can advise on that.
Great, thank you. We've got a statement here that says from an attendee, there are many Australian citizens who are applying for an exemption to travel overseas for more than 1 or 2 times and they're still getting refused.
Yeah. Yes, we are seeing. I mean, we do hear a lot of that, and I've seen some cases where the person had a very good reason to travel overseas, and they were refused. What we usually advise is, I mean, if we receive any requests for advice on that type of situation, it's worth having a look. We look at the evidence that they've provided about the reason why they need to travel. And we see if we can provide, if they can, I mean, they can apply again. There's no limit on the times of requests they can make to ask to leave Australia. But it's worth making sure that when you do apply again, there's a better chance of it being granted if you provide more information and reasons about why you need to travel. We see that for people who intend to travel for 3 months or more, they are getting the exemption to travel, to leave Australia. Yeah, so you usually need to put in the details of your flights, how long you're going, and that sort of information, yeah.
Great, thank you. Would people with quarantine debts be eligible for a work and development order to reduce the debt?
Good question. I'm not so sure about that. Probably we need to ask some of our other teams at Legal Aid who can help with that one. But you can get in touch with us. Maybe, I don't know, Christina, if you have some background about that.
No, I don't. I've heard that obviously you can set up a payment plan, as you touched on before, but in terms of a work and development order, I'm not too sure about that. But we do have a work and development order team, so
Yes.
if you give them a call, they'd be able to help with that.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've got one here. If a person is on a humanitarian visa for 5 years, do they need to apply for another visa?
If you're talking about the temporary protection visa, the SHEV, the 5-year visa, if that's what you're talking about, yeah. So the way it works is usually just before, maybe 6 months or so before the expiry of their temporary protection 5-year SHEV visa, they receive a letter from the department reminding them that their visa is about to expire or will be expiring and they should reapply. So yeah, they'll need to reapply for another temporary protection visa. So either another SHEV, another 5-year visa, or a TPV, the 3-year visa. And that's the only 2 options that they can apply for, unless the person who is holding that SHEV visa, the 5-year visa, Safe Haven Enterprise visa, has met, there's a criteria, there's a pathway within that visa that says if the person works or studies in a regional area for a period of 3.5 years, they can then have the ability to apply for different types of visas other than the temporary protection. But yeah, I mean, it's important to, I mean, it's different case by case situation. So again, if the person wants to get more detailed advice, they can definitely get in touch with us and we can advise.
Great, thank you. Another attendee has asked, if you're applying for a parent visa, which I understand can take up to 30 years processing time, are they granted a bridging visa while they wait, and can they remain in the country while they wait?
Yeah, parent visas are very complicated in terms of, it just depends on which type of parent visa or the subclass they've applied for. But if they apply for onshore, they will get a bridging visa and they can wait for a decision on that while they hold a bridging visa. Now, the problem with, one of the issues with that is they will usually, for parent visas, while waiting to get a decision on it, they don't have eligibility for Medicare or Centrelink payments. Yeah, so there's that downside to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've just had another question about whether there'll be a recording of this webinar. So yes, again, this webinar is recorded and it will be up on our Legal Aid YouTube channel. All right, are there any other questions? We'll just give you all a few minutes. Okay, great. Well, oh, we've got a question here. With the parent visa, can the parent work full-time?
Again, it really, I mean, we'll need to look at the particular visa, parent visa subclass that the person has applied for. Parent visas usually have assurance of support that the person is, when they apply for it. So yeah, it really depends on the type of subclass and the individual circumstances. Okay,
great. The contact number for legal advice, yeah. So you can call Law Access New South Wales on 1300 888 529. So that's the number to contact. Okay, great. All righty. Does anyone have any other questions? We'll just wait a few minutes. Well, thank you so much, Miriam. That was very, very useful and very helpful information. And thank you for getting to cover everyone's questions. So I believe that's the end of our webinar. We do have a number of our Law for Community Workers webinars planned for next week. You can go to the Legal Aid New South Wales workshop and webinars page on our website to find out details of our upcoming webinars and podcasts at any time. And you can even sign up to our alert newsletter on the page, where you'll receive notifications about upcoming webinars and podcasts. Again, as I said at the very beginning, at the end of our webinar, you'll be emailed an evaluation survey. We'll greatly appreciate your feedback, especially if you have any ideas about future webinar topics. So that would be really, really great. And again, you'll be receiving with that email the link to all the resources and slides that Miriam covered today. So you'll have that as well. And if you're watching this as a recorded webinar and you have any questions or you would like the PowerPoints and resources sent to your email, please email us at cle@legalaid.nsw.gov.au. Please just make sure that you include the name of the webinar in the email so we know which one you've been watching. All right, thank you so much again, Miriam.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and attending. We hope you all have a great day. We'll sign off now. Bye.
Bye-bye.